When trawling through the archives, Final Fantasy has featured a ridiculous number of bosses. But even though many are designed to be challenging, a step up from the regular encounters players would face through their quests, some are much more challenging than others. This could be because they turned out to be massive damage sponges or had devilish moves that could wipe out an entire unprepared party. But it could also be because they were designed to test a player's understanding of specific gameplay mechanics or the battle system as a whole. Today, we're going to be running through some of the bosses that stopped players in their tracks and made them rue not saving on a regular basis. But we will be introducing a few stipulations. First, this list will not feature any end bosses or super bosses, and to avoid having a list that's just filled with tons of entries from Final Fantasy X, we're going to impose a limit of one boss per game. So strap yourselves in as we're going to kick things off with Alexander from Final Fantasy XIII. Like many of the earlier Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy XIII focused on narrative progression of specific characters in isolation, and it would remain this way until much later in the game when everything opened up and players had a lot more freedom around creating their optimum party. As part of this, characters would encounter specific challenges along the way. These would see Eidolons arrive during moments of emotional stress, and their objective would be simple: test the strength of the l'Cie. It would only be by overcoming the aforementioned challenge that the l'Cie would prove their worth and gain access to enhanced abilities. What made these encounters hard was that they came almost out of nowhere, and due to how the Crystarium system was set up, it would not be possible to grind and simply overpower the Eidolons. Instead, players would only be able to progress through mastery of the paradigm system and the abilities and roles they had access to at that point. One of the earliest instances was to fight against Odin. After an emotionally charged encounter at the Vile Peaks, Odin would arrive to challenge Lightning. By joining forces with Hope, Lightning would then overcome this encounter, gaining a much clearer head, as well as the ability to call upon Odin for aid. But perhaps the most difficult Eidolon fight was against Alexander. Not many people used Hope as the main focal point of their party by this point, meaning he was often underdeveloped. The fight against Alexander would highlight this weakness, focusing attacks towards Hope with the objective of beating him down. This would often lead to an initial game over, with players then attempting not only to figure out the optimum setup, but also what they needed to do in order to impress the Eidolon. As with each of the Eidolon encounters, the victory criteria could be found by using Libra. And in the case of Alexander, the player wouldn't need to reduce its health bar to 0. Instead, they would need to keep landing chain bonuses, easiest to do with the Mystic Tower paradigm, which was composed of 2 Ravagers and a Sentinel. Final Fantasy IV featured some pretty tough boss encounters, with the battles against each of the 4 fiends proving to be a particular stumbling block for many. But we've chosen to go with the Demon Wall. Unlike the many other encounters faced up until this point in the franchise, which would beat players down due to their unfair damage outputs or ridiculous health levels, the Demon Wall introduced a mechanic that would catch players by surprise: time. This meant the Demon Wall would have limited offensive capabilities, as its ability would be to simply crush the party should they take too long to complete the encounter. It would add a whole new layer of anxiety when compared to regular boss encounters, as trying to stay alive through conventional means wasn't the issue. Instead, it all became about defeating the boss as quickly as possible. The fight itself could therefore be quite easy as long as you had a well-equipped party, but a few wrong moves would continue to add to the anxiety, and this, coupled with the unknown quantity that was introduced when facing the boss for the first time, as well as the fight being made much harder if the game was played with the fastest ATB setting, could turn what should be quite a simple fight into one that could cause quite a headache. Another boss that introduced a mechanic that would perplex players, leading to numerous game overs, was the Hellhouse. In the build-up to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, many were left wondering how the developers would go about trying to recreate the Hellhouse, a random enemy fought throughout Sector 6. And there was even a notion that because its design was so ridiculous, it might not even appear. That it did appear, as the final encounter of Don Corneo's Colosseum no less, was pretty special, but none could have predicted that the encounter would end up being so troublesome. Hellhouse would have numerous stages, each challenging the player with abilities that could deal significant damage. But the difficulty was introduced through Hellhouse's barrier shift, which would change its elemental affinity. Throughout the first 2 phases, this mechanic could be ignored without too much issue. But once the 3rd phase started, and the Hellhouse would use God House mode, exploiting barrier shift would be crucial to success. And that was because attacking its magical weaknesses would be the only surefire way of leaving it vulnerable to being pressured and then staggered. To learn the current weakness, players could either check its status using Libra or look for visual clues such as the windows being red, which would indicate a weakness to fire. Once they had this down and learnt the patterns, the fight wouldn't be too challenging, but if you went into the fight with no elemental material equipped, you would be in for a very tough time. Next on our list is Yunalesca, the poster girl on our thumbnail and the boss who destroyed many a Final Fantasy X playthrough. Everything leading up to this fateful encounter was tense. It was preceded by Yuna and her guardians finding out the painful truth about their pilgrimage, that there was no final summoning, at least not in the manner they expected. Instead, one of Yuna's guardians would have to willingly give up their lives to defeat Sin. The other gut punch was that even if they defeated Sin, the relief for Spira would only be temporary, as the final Aeon would be transformed into the next Sin. Yunalesca, having been the first summoner to call upon the power of the final Aeon, and having remained unsent for almost a millennium, was the one charged with ensuring the cycle would continue. But after realizing that Yuna did not plan to go through with the summoning, Yunalesca turned the aggressor, desperate to eliminate what she perceived to be a threat to the order that she had helped create and maintain for centuries. After a very lengthy cutscene, the fight would begin, and during the first phase, the encounter would be a bit annoying due to our excessive use of status effect counters, but it wouldn't be too challenging, and this lulled many into a false sense of security because as soon as the second phase started, Yunalesca would use Hellbiter. Not only would this inflict the zombie status, but Yunalesca would follow up by casting Regen and Cura on affected members. The temptation would be to try and reverse this, as healing spells would now damage the party and Yunalesca's damage output needed to be countered. But again, this would lull players into a trap, as the third phase would start off with Yunalesca casting Mega Death, an ability that would instantly kill any party member not affected by zombie or shielded via Deathproof. With other moves thrown in, such as Mind Blast, which would cause confuse, it all made for a pretty rough boss fight if not prepared, and when reloading after the inevitable game over, the other pain will be not being able to skip the very lengthy cutscene preceding the encounter. When Final Fantasy III was released, one of the huge innovations was its job change mechanic. Unlike the original game, this meant players would be able to change to any job they had unlocked on the fly without having to start a brand new game. It was a liberating concept, but outside of giving players a lot of freedom to express themselves and plan around certain encounters, it also gave the developers the opportunity to design bosses that could punish players for having an inefficient party setup, and no boss was more synonymous with this than Garuda. Fought in Saronia, Garuda was masquerading as Gigametz, a manipulative and cruel individual who used magic to influence King Gorn, even going so far as to try and have the king execute his own son. After the spell was broken, Gigametz's true form would be revealed, and the encounter that ensued could have ended up being the stuff of nightmares had players not paid attention to subtle clues the developers had baked into the surrounding area. It would see numerous wind spears found throughout Saronia, hinting that the player might want to use the Dragoon job. If the player chose to heed this advice and equipped the entire party in this manner, then Garuda would face a swift retribution for its crimes. But if not, the encounter stood as one of the toughest in the game, and either excessive grinding or specific strategies would need to be adopted, such as using Raven's Yaw as a scholar, in order to triumph. For our penultimate entry, we're going to explore Final Fantasy XIV, specifically a boss from Stormblood who appeared at the conclusion of the main story quest. So if you haven't got this far, here's your spoiler warning. It should be noted that the inclusion of this boss does come with a slight caveat as well, as although we said there would be no end bosses, we're arguing that even though it's the end boss of Stormblood, it's not the end boss of that particular 14 story arc. Now, Final Fantasy XIV had featured many devilish bosses by the time Stormblood had released, but within the main story quest, none possessed as much of a challenge as Shinryu, who appeared as part of the Royal Menagerie trial. From a narrative perspective, this was explained by Xenos using his power as a resonant to merge with the primal and bind it to its will, but from a gameplay perspective, it was also insane. The step up in difficulty compared to preceding dungeons and trials was very noticeable, and unlike many of them, which could be cleared using trial roulette via the duty finder, defeating Shinryu would take a well-oiled team to progress, and even then, there might be a few wipes on the road to success. One of the most challenging aspects was that in order to defeat Shinryu, everyone would need to be coordinated. For example, during the 4th phase, 2 random players would be chained together, and if they didn't perform the correct actions, then pain would be inevitable. It led to a load of discourse around release. Some players decried the huge spike in difficulty, while others just said it was difficult by design and that players needed to learn how to play the game better. Shinryu would naturally get a bit easier over time due to changes with equipment, jobs and their associated abilities, but even now, it can still pose a serious challenge if put with a team that doesn't function properly as a team. And that brings us on to Wiegraf from Final Fantasy Tactics. Wiegraf could be fought 3 times throughout the single player in Tactics, but the encounter at the Auburn Monastery will be the one to cement this notorious boss as one of the most difficult encounters in not just Final Fantasy, but also tactical role-playing games in general. What made the encounter challenging was that Ramza would have to fight against Wiegraf 1v1. There would be nowhere to hide, and no one to use as a distraction. If Ramza wasn't strong enough to take the incoming damage, you would see a swift game over. But that was only the beginning. Say you were able to best Wiegraf in this duel, you'd feel pretty good about yourself, only to find out that it was only the first part of the fight, as after being defeated, Wiegraf would transform into Belias, and although the party would come into aid, Ramza would start the fight exactly how he ended the last one. What made this even worse was the potential to be save-locked. This boss encounter came out of nowhere, so if you unfortunately saved right before, there will be no way to get back out in order to grind or change your setup. In short, if you couldn't defeat Wiegraf and Belias back to back, and you didn't have multiple saves, you'd need to start the entire game over again, which after pouring so many hours in to get to this point, will be a harsh lesson to learn. Anyway, with that, I think we're done. They were 7 of the hardest bosses you can encounter across the entire Final Fantasy franchise. Be sure to let us know in the comments the bosses you struggled most with, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Alright everyone, this is Darryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, DeLivestream and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching the video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.